So welcome everyone. It's a pleasure to be hosting these Vocal for Local dialogue series. Uh, as part of the global localization movement, Local Futures, an international non-profit organization dedicated to renewing ecological and social well-being by strengthening communities and local economies worldwide, has been collaborating with partners over 20 countries on 6 continents to host the World Localization Day program 2021. It's a worldwide event to highlight and celebrate localization, which started on 15th May with a month-long series of online as well as on-ground events. So we've had talks, discussions, workshops, hand-on activities, and creative celebrations, all with a focus on localization. This week is being celebrated as the World Localization Week that will culminate on 20th June 2021, the official World Localization Day. Hence, it's our pleasure to share with you on behalf of Vikalp Sangam, 4 organizations, Development Alternatives, National Coalition for Natural Farming, Cultivrish, and Bhumi College to be co-hosting a series of dialogues as part of the World Localization Day program. In the backdrop of the crisis, the COVID-19 pandemic, the first session was held on 7 June 2021, brought together examples of alternatives and solutions at farming and forestry communities, women collectors, individuals, civil society organizations, and many stakeholders had just finished it. My colleague will just share the link in the chat. The discussion today in the Trialogue will be focusing on ways to enable a supportive ecosystem for local green enterprises, laying emphasis on the food system. The conversations will center on better understanding the term local, getting deeper into the possibility of developing a framework to assess the local green enterprises, and of course, look at the signature issues that local green agri-entrepreneurs face in scaling up their initiatives. One of the reasons we call this a dialogue series is the tri perspectives that each of our panelists will bring in. And we hope to have an interactive session. Please feel free to put your questions in the chat. As long as we've done some opening rounds, we'll be, of course, getting into a more interactive Q&A format. There are a few people I can think of, very few people I can think of who can really kickstart the conversation on this particular topic. And one of them, of course, is Dr. Ashok Khosla, the founder of Development Alternatives, and of course, a pioneer in systems thinking and environmental solutions. So, ladies and gentlemen, the man himself, Ashok Khosla, if you could just share a few thoughts and set the context of it. No, you're still mute. I think the host, IT team, can you just make sure that he's unmuted?
I should be unmuted.
Now you are.
Oh, okay. Sorry about that. Thanks, Kanika. I was just saying that it's a wonderful series that you've got here because it really goes to the heart of the issues that we're dealing with. You know, for an inveterate optimist like myself, it's very hard to say this, but the future has been looking very bleak unless things change pretty radically, and very soon the world in which your generation and the next generation after that is going to live is not going to be a pretty place. It's going to be tough, much, much tougher in the next 50 years than it was the last. And we've seen things deteriorate on the fronts of almost everything: the economy, the ecology, the life support systems. Virtually everything has gone downhill. And for 50 years, we've been having these summits and these agreements and these conventions on climate change, on biodiversity, on ozone layers, on oceans, on everything. And yet things not only don't seem to be improving, but they continue to get worse. So we've got to go to the root causes. We've got to now look and see why it is that whether you live in the global north or in the south, things are worse for most people. A few rich people get richer and better off, but the very large numbers get poorer and poorer. And nature, Mother Nature, is the one that pays the biggest cost of all. So now what we've got to think about is why. And one of the big whys is the theories of modern economics, what is called neoclassical economics, are very narrowly conceived. And I've been coming to the conclusion, not only narrowly, but wrongly conceived. The whole idea of accumulation of capital, capitalism, so-called liberalization, privatization, greed is good, globalization, are all driven by ideas like economies of scale. There's no such thing as an economy of scale if half your costs are buried in nature, if half your costs are passed on to other people, to society. Obviously, you're going to get economies of scale because somebody else is paying for it. If only we were to think about our food production, our manufacturing, our services in a more totalistic or holistic way, and make sure that the real costs are accounted for, both from the benefits or from the expenses side, then you have a chance of getting it right. Food production, for example, in our country, in all over the world, was a sane enterprise. Farmers used to have to pay full costs and they produced food, and food was bought by people in cities, consumers, and they paid properly for it. But as time went on, what you might call the terms of trade, using economist language, got worse and worse for the farmer and better for the urban consumer, because the urban consumer was more powerful, was able to vote, was able to lobby, was able to persuade policymakers that his or her getting cheaper food was much better for the people who govern than it was for the producer, the farmer, to make more money. So, the thing is that localization is not a new concept. It's been around a long time. In fact, most of history, human society was localized. But in the last 200 years, things went awry. They basically get lopsided in the ways that we know. And during that period, there were very few people who questioned it. From the times of classical economists, the Marshalls, the Adam Smiths, and so on, nobody really questioned the idea that the more you concentrated, the more you specialized, the more you built bigger and so-called better, the cheaper it would be, and therefore more and more people would benefit. But there were a few people who saw through that, and Mahatma Gandhi was one of them. Mahatma always said that your economics doesn't make any sense if you go on trying to just basically feed the greed of people. You won't have any idea of how you're going to do that with growing populations and growing desires and greeds. So I would like basically to see my partners in this panel talk about more specific issues about food security, nutrition, and a lot of other things that we're concerned about. But I think one of the big issues that all of us have to keep in mind is that the shibboleths, these false ideas that we have, like efficiency, which is a misnomer, because most efficiency is when you don't take account of the real costs. The economies of scale, the value chain, so-called, the subsidizing of costs of transport, for example, subsidizing the cost of water. You know about virtual water. India exports, I think the most valuable export, the most valuable commodity of all for export of India is brains, frankly. Our best brains are all mostly exported to California or to the East Coast or to Europe or to wherever. But the second most important resource is water. And we're exporting huge quantities of water at virtually no remuneration, no benefit to us, through the export of water-intensive foods. like rice, like wheat, and all the other things. So we are actually living a nonsense economics. And when we talk about localization, we're talking basically about bringing back that economics of the real costs. I think I should, before I end, say that localization also means empowerment. It means empowering communities. It means empowering households and the individuals to take care of themselves and to do so in consonance with natural cycles. It's now easy to go into a supermarket and buy vegetables all year round because you import them. If you want an apple off season, it'll come in from Chile. And the real costs of all that growth in Chile and the transport and the cold storage and bringing over here has never been taken care of because it's all being subsidized by nature. And it's also been subsidized by governments subsidizing the rich owners of the shipping companies, the cold storage plants and everything else. So I hope that this session will bring out some of these ideas so that you and I, we as individuals can start dealing with them. Eating in season is not only a good thing from an Ayurvedic point of view, or it's a healthy point of view, but it's also a very sensible economic intervention on the part of every one of us. So thank you for letting me start this process, but I'm really looking forward to what all my other colleagues have to say on this. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Khosla. I think that really set the context of what we're hoping the conversation is going to be about, which is removing the fallacy of some of the terms that have been circulating for the last couple of years. The understanding of scale in a very linear way, or efficiencies, or subsidization of transportation, like you mentioned, or even growth that is unprecedented and just multiplies. I think the pandemic is an example of that. Someone is always paying the costs. I think it's also a very important lesson that the pandemic, or rather, I'd like to say that it's the fault lines that have been exposed by the pandemic of how disconnectedness is a real test of resilient local systems. And to really get a little bit deeper into what we really mean by some of the terms that we've been using: localization, local green entrepreneurship, the resilient food systems. I'd like to ask my colleague Stella to share a very short presentation on the perspectives that we might hold, which is actually a co-creative space, because we'd love to get feedback, interactions, and dialogue to really create a movement of sort on this. Stella?
Yes, thank you, Kanika. Is my screen visible?
Yes, please.
Thank you so much. So taking forward from where Dr. Khosla actually left, we know now that the patterns of economic growth that have been adopted for a very long time, they have been at the cost of the resilience of local economies and the ecosystem. So now it is important for us, in order to find real solutions, that we actually need more and more stronger support from all the actors involved, especially the businesses at all levels. Now, in this regard, it's actually important that we talk about the micro, small, and medium enterprises, especially the micro and small ones. This is because, as we all know, they significantly contribute to the GDP of the country and to total exports, and also employ more than 120 million people. So for this reason, it is actually very critical to have this conversation, because it is important for India to actually enable a favorable ecosystem for these entrepreneurs. Now, these micro and small enterprises will be able to move towards a more greener way of working only when the conditions around help it to. And in order for these micro and small enterprises to transition to local green enterprises, as we call them, it is important that we look at a few things. Now, before we go ahead, local green enterprises are actually those micro and small enterprises that build their business models on the principles of resource efficiency and circular economy, while also creating decent jobs and boosting the local economy. And so they are critical enablers of green and inclusive recovery. So moving ahead, just a few indicators that we have listed for to measure the localness of these enterprises across the three parameters of economic, social, and environment. We'll discuss these later with an example. Now, as we go ahead and as we are seeing around, in this regard, the most significant sector which has actually emerged has been the agriculture and food system. And according to the latest economic survey of India, the agriculture sector is in fact the only sector that has shown a positive growth rate of about 3.4% at constant prices in the last year. Now we realize that farmers and enterprises are working across the local food system value chain, and even they need to rework their strategies with, of course, support from an enabling ecosystem. Now, one such example is the scheme of fund for regeneration of traditional industries, which is the Spurti scheme as it is. This is an initiative by the Ministry of Micro, Small and Medium Enterprises to promote cluster development. And as the name suggests, it is also for the regeneration of traditional industries. Now, this also includes a few agro-based food processing industries. And the final objective of this initiative is actually to increase the income of these farmers by at least 3 times. Now, let's look at one such example from the ground. Now, the BR Hills Wild Bee Honey Cluster is situated in Karnataka. Now, this is the Soliga tribal community which is present here, and it is restricted only to Karnataka and Tamil Nadu, and they just have a population of about 40,000. Now, they are shifting cultivation, and there is a collection of non-timber forest produce that is being taking place, including honey. Now, wild bees are very commonly found over here in these forests, and they are known to increase the yield of honey, and the cultivation is also a major portion of the income of the Soliga community. Now, going ahead, we have tried to list down a few basic indicators against the economic parameter to begin with. So, a few things that this cluster does in this particular region of Karnataka is value addition of the existing product by designing and packaging it, also putting it in glass bottles and selling it. And they also ensure that there is local market consumption. And most importantly, they also use local technology for farming. A few other things that are listed: they ensure that the cultivation is hygienic and sustainable, and they're also marketing it through this brand called as Adavi. Now, one very important thing that is there as part of this cluster is that there is a provision of safety gears and advanced equipment that is given to these cultivators. This reduces the wastage, increases the productivity, and hence the income. Now, talking about a few social indicators, a few indicators that we have listed include social cohesion, increasing the local employment, empowering women, ensuring decent livelihoods, and especially the health and education of women and the girl child. Now, against this particular cluster is actually a part of a lot of cooperatives, so that helps in resolving local issues. And this particular cluster actually ensures that the tribal livelihood is maintained, which is actually a very important thing since they are very few in number. And they also empower approximately 50 women by making them economically independent. Now, looking at a very few basic environmental indicators, we have looked at water and waste management. We've also looked at trying to organically cultivate and also preserve the local biodiversity. Now, against this cluster is very strong, as there is no manual plantation that actually disturbs the ecosystem. Also, no bees get killed in this entire process of extracting honey, as there is no smoke that is being used to extract it. The wild bee is conserved, and the comb is actually put back from where more honeycombs can grow on the same tree. So this is something which is very strong on all the three economic, social, and environmental parameters. Is there something you'd like to add? Hello?
Stella?
Yeah, Kanika, is there something you'd like to add?
No. Please go ahead.
Okay.
Thanks. Thanks so much, Stella. I think the idea of this presentation is mainly to give a sense of the possibilities that are out there. I think there are examples that literally coexist as a oasis of what the future possibilities are. And the idea is to have this chat and how we can really create many more of these. And to do that, I'd like to just take a few minutes to introduce our esteemed panelists. We have with us Mr. Kapil Mandavala, who is the CEO of Edible Roots. Kapil studied the management of information systems and finance from University of Texas at Austin. He then worked for Deloitte Consulting in San Francisco as a senior consultant for 5 years. After many years in the United States, in 2008, Kapil relocated to Gujarat to start organic farming at his 22-acre farmland. During the next 5 years, he established a community-supported agriculture CSA system through which residents could buy local, seasonal, and fresh produce directly from the farm. He then founded Edible Roots in 2015 with the aim to help more and more people grow their own food. We have also with us today Mr. Mirko Zurker, who is the head of Seed Asia Co-Lead Policy. Mirko is a specialist in sustainability, entrepreneurship, green finance, and sustainable consumption and production. He is responsible for program development for the Seed Partnership and has extensive experience in managing dialogue processes and developing practice-oriented toolkits. The regional focus of his work is on Africa and Asia region. He has supported Seeds since 2009 and has implemented the Seeds Green Recovery Ecosystem Builder program. At Seed, Mirko coined the term toolification as he developed several business incubation acceleration toolkits focused on topics such as eco-inclusive innovation, business modeling, market research. Before joining Seed, Mirko worked as a freelance journalist for multiple media outlets and conducted policy analysis in his work at the Press and Information Office of the Federal Government of Germany. We also have with us Professor Shambhu Prasad, who is the Professor of Strategic Management, Institute of Rural Management, Anand. He coordinates a project on living farm income, civil action, equity, and sustainability, and founded IRMA's Incubation Center, iSeed, for rural, social, and collective enterprises. His expertise in science and innovation policy and his education has been multidisciplinary with a basic training in mechanical engineering and master's in industrial management with specialization in science policy. His publications and teaching have been in the domains of social entrepreneurship, rural livelihood, sustainable agriculture, innovation management, managing producer collectives, and sustainable transitions. He was awarded the Wilgross CSIE Award for academic contribution to the field of social entrepreneurship in April 2013 and was a Fulbright Nehru Senior Research Fellow attached to Cornell University, pursuing a long-term study on the systems of rice intensification. We also have, through a video, she couldn't join us today due to unforeseen circumstances, Dr. Suman Sahai, who has a distinguished scientific career in the field of genetics, is a recipient of the Padma Shri and the Birbal Sahni Gold Medal and the Order of the Golden Ark. Dr. Sahai is founder chairperson of Gene Campaign, which is leading research and advocacy organization working on issues relating to food and nutrition and livelihoods. She has chaired India's Planning Commission Task Force on Agrobiodiversity and Genetically Engineered Organisms for the 11th Plan. She was a member of the steering committee of the National Biodiversity Board, the expert committee on the biotechnology policy, and the bioethics committee of the Indian Council of Medical Research. She has served on the research advisory committees of national scientific institutions. It's truly an honor to be hosting this conversation with such esteemed panelists who are going to be sharing such diverse perspectives. To start with, if we can just have the video by Dr. Sahai, who will be just sharing her thoughts on what she feel are real practices that can unlock the challenges that we have currently. I'd request my team to start the video.
I think one of the very sobering messages that we have got recently, not so recently, is that there is more plastic in the ocean than there are fish in it. Now that should really set us thinking. Is that the level to which we've polluted our earth so that it has gone beyond a point? And the same thing is happening with climate change. The amount of emissions we've already put into the atmosphere will carry on even if we had to stop all emissions tomorrow. Is that the extent to which we've really ruined our planet? Yes, it is. And I think it is really time to stop dead in our tracks and look at our model of development. And I think a lot of thinking people have been looking at our model of development for the last several years without really coming to any very great alternative conclusions that are being accepted by governments. But one of the things that we have not heard so much about, and which I'd like to highlight here, is that we have not paid enough attention to indigenous knowledge systems. Now, the United States will have very little indigenous knowledge systems because they don't have that many indigenous communities that they haven't ruined. The original Americans certainly had indigenous and still continue to have indigenous knowledge, but nobody is talking to them. It's the same thing in our country. We have such a wealth of indigenous knowledge in almost every sphere, whether it is in production of goods that we need in our homes, or whether it is food production, which is, of course, an absolutely crucial and critical area. Our tribal and rural communities over millennia have tried, have experimented, and have conserved knowledge. So we're really foolish. I mean, as policymakers, we're really dunderheads for not looking at this huge body of knowledge that we have. Let's just take food production, for example, or one or two aspects of rural life. If we look at the way that rural communities and Adivasi communities manage their food and, day-to-day living, they do it in a way that is very sustainable. There is enough, as Mahatma Gandhi said. There can be enough, and there usually is in the Adivasi communities. There is enough for everybody's need. The problem starts when there are people who want to fulfill their greed, and that's what's gone wrong with our development model. So if you look at agriculture, what is it that we cannot do? In fact, even today, if you look at Indian agriculture, it rests, even though it's not acknowledged, it rests on the fact that farmers are very, very smart people. Farmers are scientists. Farmers are scientists because they continuously experiment with their crops, with their seeds, with agricultural systems, and they know a lot. So we are extraordinarily stupid not to talk to them. If you look at the matter of seeds, Gene Campaign has done a big collection of traditional rice varieties from Eastern India, from our base in Jharkhand. So Jharkhand, Chhattisgarh, Northeast, coming down to Orissa, Bengal, etc. You look at the knowledge that exists about these traditional seeds. So when we collect these rice samples, we don't just collect the seed, we also collect the knowledge that the farming community has. And you would be astonished to know the amount that they know. And men and women know differently. So women have been traditionally seed keepers, so they know a little bit more. They know the more important things. They know how long suppose you harvest rice. How long will this variety last? How long will the other varieties last? What is the cooking quality? How much time does it need to take? Need to cook? How long does it keep after cooking? Now, these are very important things to know when you're living without refrigerators. I mean, if I cook rice in the morning, is it going to keep till the evening? Is it going to keep till the next day? And these communities know which rice varieties will go sour quickly and which rice varieties will keep till the next day. These are very important, even commercial properties that they know of. We once did a study on seed systems. And if you look at how seed was treated by village communities and how much interaction there was between communities. So seed came as dowry, not dowry, but seed came with the woman when she came into her married home and brought seed. At festivals, on occasions of marriages and gatherings when communities gathered, went to other villages, they carried seed with them. And with that seed, they carried the knowledge, the properties. Is this seed short maturing? Is this variety a short maturing, early maturing variety, or is this a long duration variety? It's the farmers who will tell you this. Plant breeders go to farmers to find out. So now, having said that, if we want to look at how to make our lives more sustainable, how to stop killing the planet, then we will need to look at the wisdom of the rural way of life, which means, I mean, sustainability is a big word, but it means doing as much as you can with local resources. I mean, we're talking about the World Localization Day. Localization means keeping your economy local, circular and local. This is what Mahatma Gandhi said. You don't really have to go hugely far away to earn a living, to eat well, to look after your health. Look at the richness of knowledge there is in indigenous systems of healing. They have veterinary care, they have human health care, they know how to treat the horses and donkeys, the pigs and goats, they know how to treat us. So if you look at food production, you look at health, you look at conserving water, they know what water sources can be conserved how. So in the mountains, for example, there's the whole system of gulls. And those communities know where the catchments are, how to share water equitably so that the people who are upstream don't have all the water. The gulls, which are these channels for directing water from the source downstream, those are so well managed, or they used to be so well managed by the mountain communities that needed to conserve water. So, or you look at the kumhar, the potter. We've replaced our water utensils with plastic. So the gharas that we had made of terracotta are now made of plastic. When they were made of terracotta, it was baked from local mud available. There was a whole community of kumars or potters who would do that for the whole village. There were blacksmiths who would prepare all the agricultural implements. There were carpenters, there were healers. All of this was in a self-sustained village community. And make no mistake, it's not as though they were isolated and living in silos. They were very well connected to other communities. So it really was a network of communities, Adivasi communities, farming communities, rural communities of other professions. They knew each other. They knew people. I mean, there would be, for example, if you were talking to a blacksmith who knew how to make a plow, would know of some master, some ustad in many villages away who knew how to mend a broken plow. So these extraordinary skills in really all walks of life that are essential to our survival and that are essential to our living well. These skills, this information, this knowledge exists. And to give you an example, of Gene Campaign's rice collections, we shared 324 traditional rice varieties with the Indian Agriculture Research Institute in Delhi to analyze this as a gene pool, because tomorrow's oil is going to be genetic material. It's going to be the genes that exist because everybody needs to go through the biological pathway of making products now. That's why biotechnology developed. When we shared these varieties with IRI, they discovered 2 new genes in that were effective or provided resistance to 2 very dangerous rice diseases called rice blast. Now, here is an example of how you combine indigenous knowledge with so-called modern science. Indigenous knowledge is also a science. It's a very sophisticated science. And if we had the brains to value our indigenous knowledge, we would know how to use it even in the contemporary context. So my point here on World Localization Day is look local, because there is such a wealth of knowledge, skills, resources, assets that you have in and around you that can make your life and your economy sustainable. And I'll repeat again, these are not silos. Rural communities are not disconnected. They are connected through links of marriage, of relationships, of festivals, of celebrations of different kinds, melas, hearts. They come together and they exchange knowledge, and they are aware where not specialized knowledge exists. If it doesn't exist in their own village, they know where to get it. So it's it used to be a very vibrant community of skilled people who we have so neglected, with great detriment to our own way of developing ourselves in a sustainable way, so that we do not finish off our environment for 5 rupees. I'll end there.
So Dr. Sahai has, very beautifully described pieces of the system that need to work for, building resilient food systems. One, I think her point on whose voice is being vocalized is extremely important. Farmers' voices, is an essential aspect. Are we really truly listening to the communities and the farmers while developing the solutions and working with them? I think along with the point of her highlighting the flows, the traditional knowledge flows, the information, resource flows, very beautifully designed and informal practices, something that we might want to go back to, including the way how one person's waste is another person's resource. A circular economy doesn't have to be just about one linear process of, a circle of waste utilization, but also linkages that can be formed. I think one crucial aspect that she had also, of course, spoken about was the practices, and we're very fortunate to have a couple with us today who is a practitioner himself and who has, day in, day out been working to solve the challenge there is. Kapil, I just want to hear, opening thoughts on, if you were to look at the current food system in India, how does value add happen? Does micro and small entrepreneurship thrive? How does that get developed? And let's also address the question of scale a little bit as well. For someone like you, who's a practitioner, who's a social entrepreneur, who's working in the system, how would you transcend scale? What is the biggest challenge? If you had a magic wand and you were asked, okay, tell me 1 or 2 of the top things that you would really like to sort of unlock to reach the scale that we're talking about. systemic scale, just to sort of clarify.
Hi, everyone. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yep, we can.
Okay, great. I'm glad to be here today. I think it's been very interesting discussion so far. Just want to share a few thoughts and leave it open to the participants to sort of interact, create a further discussion on this. But I think what you left with, Kanika, is about how to address scale and how to how to make it sort of feasible for the small and the medium enterprises to get to scale. I think it's not a challenge that has one solution or one sort of primary answer to it, but there are different facets. As an organization that's ourselves in that category where we are still growing, still a young organization, I think what I realize or what I'm learning is that one of the ways to scale in today's time is somewhere it's about decentralizing. Uh, Compared to traditional times when you used to have multiple sort of branches or offices and spread across various localities. I think the way to scale is in today's time is to somehow decentralize whatever is that you are taking to the people at large. How do you also create micro entrepreneurs? How do you take it to each society, to each institution, or to each area of a city or a village? So the idea is to somehow find a way to grow what you're doing by involving others, by creating a community around it, by creating participation. That's something that what we are striving for. That's what we're trying to move towards as we sort of try to scale ourselves and grow into other parts of the country. A few other thoughts that I want to just share around around the theme for today about localization, about food, about what it means to us. Our entire organization, our entire vision is built around the idea of bringing food closer to us. Bringing and closer inherently means local, that is growing around us. We have seen that over the last 7-8 decades, the food has gone farther and farther from us, and in some sense, a lot of the challenges that we face with the quality of the food, with the authenticity of our food, that has happened over the last 7-8 decades is because of this distance getting increased. Somewhere the food has gone far away from us. It's traveling on average about 800 kilometers in India right now, and I think this is what creates the challenge as well, and as something that we've been trying to address. We started in a very small manner by helping people learn how to grow their own food, whether it's a small space around their house or whether it's a small piece of land. But today we're taking it to the larger audience through many other things that we do as an organization. But also uh, making this, what happens when people start getting involved in the idea of growing food is also they start creating some respect, some for the not for the food itself, not only for the food itself, but also for the farmers who are growing it, because they sort of understand what is entailed in this entire task of growing it, and what food means to us. So I think bringing food closer, I think that is sort of the theme that we have been around, and I think. Uh, I mean, the other ways we are working towards this is also uh, uh, the main thing being that we need to know three fundamental answers about our food: who is growing it, where is it being grown, and how is it being grown. And this can only happen when we start asking questions about who is growing it, about whatever we're buying from the market, how do we get the answers for that. So that's the idea behind how I see local and how I see the scaling bit also happening.
Thank you so much, Kapil. I think very well said. I think your point about respecting, being connected to the food, to food and the system around you is extremely important. And I think it makes you rethink scale in general as well, and see it more in decentralized, as we'd like to call it, decentralized micro movements as opposed to one, growth spurt. So Mirko, I'd like to, great to see you again, by the way. I'd like to come to you now to another big question around scale finance, where, innovation and finance, they don't really necessarily go hand in hand, yet you've been at the forefront of, such kind of conflicting objectives. And what do you think? Where is the innovation? What is required? Time is running out, yet you also need finance which has long-term returns. So just your thoughts on that.
Yeah, thank you, Kanika. Indeed, kind of great to be here on this World Localization Day. I mean, with SEED, SEED is kind of type 2 partnership and is basically formed to support local action. We are turning 20 next year, and we were in Johannesburg at the World Summit of Sustainable Development. There we kind of came together as a partnership at that time. Different governments, but also UNDP, UNEP, IOCN came together to support local action, community-based enterprises, but also other enterprises. So we are basically have supported more than 1,000 enterprises around the globe. Also in India have done quite a bit of work, and indeed finance is a critical piece of it. And maybe I would like to bring it down into kind of 3 levels of innovation, where innovation needs to happen at the intermediary level, at the financer level, and then maybe also at the DFI or donor level, which are providing finance to those finances. I think first I would like to start with us and first think a bit about, before we talk about the solutions, always frame a bit the challenge that we see there. I think we have basically supported green enterprises, locally driven green enterprises around the globe, and understand obviously that they need kind of tailored advice, they need tailored support, but we also as intermediaries, as support organizations, we also need to understand better what kind of financing they need. And I think this is what we have understood over the time. There are very kind of different kind of trajectories. For example, maybe in this space, people were also, since a couple of years, people talk about impact investing, but the solution actually there is we need to debunk this whole myth of impact investing, need to understand also how we can educate the market and also how we can support these different trajectories of enterprises to have a kind of proper expectation management and understand really enterprises have a different trajectory, and from the finances perspective, there are different costs, different risks associated with it, and we need to basically align our support processes to basically support different trajectories for enterprises which are more looking at grant finance, where others look more at equity finance, which is often associated with impact investing, and where others maybe more look at kind of debt. And I think this is also, especially for this locally based enterprises, an issue that we need to understand better when we talk financial innovation, also as intermediaries, what is it that is needed? And I think actually also in the Indian case, what we have seen often, actually loan financing, even though interest rates are pretty steep, are actually in quite a couple of cases much better matching than when people talk at equity investment, because scale, also connecting it to scale to Kapil's point, I think when you look at impact equity investment, often they look at completely different trajectories, and especially for this locally based enterprises, this kind of trajectories are often just impossible to reach. And this is basically up to us to also educate the market a bit to understand when we talk impact investment, it's maybe relevant for other green enterprises, but maybe not for all of them. The second level is where I would like to talk a bit about, like at the financer level, right? And I would like to talk also a bit about banks and also the challenges that are existing there that we have seen, and also related to kind of localization. I think what we have seen quite a bit that banks have especially issues to understand this kind of local context, to assess basically the markets that these green enterprises are in, because often market data is not available. It's also very difficult to understand this kind of growth potential, because we all know most of these enterprises are in this kind of last mile context, and there often it's very difficult to assess this kind of what are the costs for local expansion, and this kind of information is not accessible for banks to really assess what is kind of the cost and risk associated with it. So from our perspective, it's up to us, but also up to bankers actually to better kind of document also like this kind of success stories also with data. I mean, what we have seen a lot, bankers, investors, they like to share also success stories, which are very kind of anecdotal, but it needs to be better really also documented, better shared within this kind of finances community, making also their data assessment tracks, grids more accessible, and being also more open about bottlenecks and failures. Because I mean, we have seen in our space, I think this has reached now after kind of 10 years of the movement of impact investing, I think we are at the next step, and we need to basically bring more transparency also in this whole finances market to really kind of change the game there. And the third level is, I would like to talk a bit about more the DFI and development finance institution and donor level. What we have seen from the seed perspective in the last couple of years is that people talk now climate finance, people talk kind of green finance, and what our donors and development finance institutions are generally, when they talk scale, they still believe in development finance institutions, which are in the Indian context more the NABARDs and the SIDBs, right? And they are the ones which often receive what is labeled as green finance, as climate finance. But what we generally see also that when it comes to all this kind of projects, we have analyzed all the kind of global climate funds, that only 3% goes to MSMEs. So I think what we see from DFI and donor level, there needs to be, people talk about the ambition, but there needs to be much more money of this global climate finance, green finance money going into MSMEs. And beyond just putting more money into it, I think DFIs and donors, also from the solution perspective, they need to basically also go beyond not looking only at the kind of classical development banks, but also look at kind of new vehicles. I think in India, it's actually quite exciting examples. You have a lot of kind of non-banking financing institutions. I think there are, just to name a few, there is Anchor Capital, there's Caspian Impact Investing, Grameen Capital, Seekers Finance. You see a lot of innovation happening where also, what, to just use this term, where blended finance, where also some of the donors blend their finance also with kind of other commercial capital. And this is more and more happening, but still not enough. And especially when it comes to this micro SMEs, much more innovation needs to happen. And a lot more, the kind of international development finance community needs to come on board, because I mean, what we also from the seed perspective, and I think we are definitely happy to be also part of the development alternatives family. We believe in this kind of local climate action. I mean, we sometimes say also it's better to have lampposts than lighthouses. And if you would think of thousands of lampposts, which are like these local actions, which maybe don't can actually achieve the same amount of impact than a few lighthouses out there. So also very much looking forward to this discussion today, and yeah, and see this definitely home with this whole idea of decentralized local action. Thanks, Kanika.
Thanks so much, Mirka. I'd really like how you'd focus on customizing finance and the solutions at different scales. Who is actually solving it at the micro, meso, and the macro scale, but also getting away from that one standard fit all kind of formula. And it's so true, because the needs of a micro enterprise is so different than even a small enterprise, and somehow we put them in that one sort of black hole of space, where things get lost. And I think knowledge itself, I think you brought up a very important aspect of where there are gaps in knowledge and information at both sides. I think even our understanding of some of these words that we're using is very, very different. And I think we do need to come to one space, or at least have some sense of a common understanding, including the evidence that is the data that is being built, and measuring change. And I think Professor Prasad, I don't think anyone else has spent so much time looking at this aspect of agriculture systems. So just a few thoughts on How do we even define local food systems? How do we define local? How do we measure impact?
Thanks, Kanika, and it's very nice to be celebrating the World Localization Day. And I think, I'm looking forward to the time when India is known for localization as much as we're going to celebrate the International Yoga Day a few days soon after. Uh, we need to celebrate localization much more. So I would like to just try and start with understanding a bit on localization and how do we see it in today's context. Uh, I guess the pandemic has brought out, and I think Dr. Khosla was referring to it indirectly. I think the current state of our economy with all its faults, the fact that we are seeing increasing inequality, much more unemployment, and so on. There is also a return of the rural. So we are talking about the need to, in some sense, press the reset button. While we talk about the economy of scale, it's also a good opportunity for us to go back to, of course, Gandhi was referred to by both Dr. Suman Zahai and Dr. Khosla, but also our economist, J.C. Kumarappa, who wrote this book on the economy of permanence. When we talk of sustainability, and I think he has a beautiful description of the predatory economy, the parasitical economy, an economy of enterprise, the economy of aggregation, and the economy of service. And how do we move along this, kind of grid, if so to speak? How do we look at the local today? How can local markets be reimagined? And I think one thing we need to probably understand is that it might help us to go out of the binaries. It's important to understand the categories, but let's say a local market today is not the same as the local market that you would see 10 years back, 20 years back. So in a sense, because of the issue of price and value getting confused, we often find that local is expensive at the local level. But so rather than being pedantic about it, I think the important part about local is about relations and trust. And I think this requires both an empowered producer as well as a conscious consumer. The latter shaping up partly with increased health consciousness of citizens probably after the pandemic. I think the challenge for us is to make the connections between these two and recreate what one would consider short supply chains, where the intermediaries are also invested, not eliminated, in the broader idea of localization. So how do we make this happen? And I think the first thing we need to look at is the need to reframe some of these narratives. The UN Food Systems has, the track 4 talks about this problem. And I'm glad that they bring this out upfront, where they say the real challenge for us is on livelihoods. It is, reducing inequality and looking at power imbalances. So we can't talk of localization without addressing this issue of power. A standard narrative, which you will find in the CGIAR narratives, how could you feed 400 to 500 million more people every year? And this repeats in ad infinitum in the way we look at the issue of food systems. And therefore, we come out with a solution. So therefore get, let's say, high yielding new hybrid rice strains or genetically engineered crops or hydroponics or various kinds of solutions. And I think while you can solve the food problem at some level, you're going to forget the people problem. So you can actually move in a direction where we have food, but we don't have people producing this food. So I think we need to ask different questions, look beyond price and efficiency. How sustainable is the sourcing? How sustainable is the supply chain? How do we make the local aspirational once again? I think the Prime Minister has invited us to look at vocal for local. It's a very good direction. But I would say with some caution that it should not become, to use Gandhi's phrase, an opportunity to replace the white man with the brown and replicating the same structures. We, in a sense, need not just Swadeshi, which might tantamount to replacing, boycotting Chinese goods and replacing them with Indian multinational corporations or the equivalent, but true Swaraj, which is actually a multitude of local brands. And I think, we need to work towards providing this identity for local in a big way. And that's an investment. That's not going to happen overnight. Development finance does have a role in making this happen. So I just want to mention very briefly a few examples, some of which we've looked at closely, partly involved in one of them. So Earth 360 is an enterprise that we've been supporting. It's now a 10-year-old green enterprise based in a drought-prone region of Andhra Pradesh. The founders are committed to sustainability. They are, in a sense, profitable the way we understand it. It's a 1 crore business turnover. And they're working on millets and the food system. Now, when they started, millets was not very well known, so they had to popularize it, work across the value chain, getting farmers to get the right kinds of millets, educate them on it. And then the public distribution system was not in favor. Sometimes they would reduce the prices. So they said, let's try and work and link it up with the market, make recipes out of this. So they worked across this value chain. And then they realized that the processing machinery was not designed to meet these local requirements. So they took up this technical challenge and then worked actively to upgrade some of these machines, because I don't want to go into the technical details. And as a result, the spin-off happened. So they developed a community-based grader where villagers can, you can have a transportable grader, which works very well, and it can also be using solar power. And the villagers are then able to produce and send process grade, or at least graded produce of millets to the factory that they have. And that seems to be a win-win situation for both. They went further ahead in trying to say, let's not just work on the Japanese challah that we have, but let's rework it, and they re-engineered it. But the main point here is two things with regard to localization. They chose not to go to scale and set up across the country. They said, we are developing a decentralized model with good technology, good products, and so on. And it is up to others to learn from this and set up something similar. And we are probably happy to share this kind of knowledge. And I think one of the elements is that they have not forgotten the local in their journey. So they are trying to service the local markets, getting their employees, who are largely women, to also start taking millets as part of their daily product. The point is, the conventional assessment of this enterprise is always looked at the potential for equity investments and so on. But can we make this localization factor an important element in sustainability of looking at enterprises? So we need to understand different metrics and seek out this kind of an information. Dharani is a mutually aided cooperative society, again in the same district of Anantapur, supported by the Timbuktu Collective. And I think an institutional innovation like the participatory guarantee scheme has brought producers and consumers together. You don't need to have expensive third-party certification if you're not selling in Europe and other kinds of markets. But the consumers would like to know, and they have set this process. So this is an institutional innovation that creates trust. And what is interesting in the way they report their metrics to their investors, there's a story of ethical investing in that as well, is that every year they're reporting the amount of local employment that they have created and the livelihoods that they have enhanced. So can we look at multiple reporting metrics rather than just profit as the sole parameter? A third initiative which we were involved as citizens in Anand was to work with a farmer producer organization which was facing a serious problem with the pandemic, and they could not supply the mangoes in Ahmedabad. And a small initiative of the campus residents of IRMA and our sister institutions was to see whether this idea of conscious consumerism can be rooted in, where people can get carbide-free mangoes at their doorsteps, but they are willing to take that additional element. And of course, a set of volunteers tried reducing the risk by saying that we will not have cash on delivery, but we will take pre-orders and then work things out. And I think it's important for consumers to minimize the risk for producers and a farmer producer organization, because the systems are not necessarily geared to go beyond. It created an atmosphere. People from Delhi wanted these mangoes as well. Of course, we could deliver them there. But I think within this area, there is a scope for innovation by consumers taking a more active role. Kapil did speak about urban farming initiatives, and of course, he knows much more on this. And I think by providing information, you can create spaces for engagement and action that can make a difference in many such community-supported agriculture initiatives. Now, how do we look at these diverse institutional forms? One is a volunteer initiative, another is a farmer-producer organization, the third is a social enterprise, and so on. What's common about these diverse experiences and institutional forms? And I think I just want to bring three elements, which is a frame which I think can be used across. This is suggested also in the United Nations World Food Systems Dialogue. The first one is to build the agency of the farmers, their resilience and autonomy. In some cases, it's been done directly. In some cases, it's done indirectly. So when we talk about the future of farming systems, we need to ask how many of the other players and alternatives. And today we are hearing about these alternatives, which has been summarized as DAM: digitization, automation, molecular technologies, and nature modification. So how many of these DAM alternatives are actually empowering the farmers beyond, and are they able to really give us serious metrics about this or not? The second point is about changed relations. Today, given the imbalanced power structures, all of us need to work towards building greater trust. Institutional change is very critical in this, consumers doing things differently. And this change is not just with producers, it is also with other institutions, intermediaries who may not necessarily be consistently in the chain, resident welfare associations, academic institutions, etc. So can researchers not see themselves only as centers of excellence, but as facilitators of innovation? In working in collaboration across disciplines and across actors, much more needs to be done in this space. The third issue, which is a more bigger issue, and that has a lot to do with public policy, both at the local, national, and global level, is about transforming structures. And I think learning plays an important part of it, and there is a need to invest in social and institutional learning. And I think it's important to create learning alliances. We could discuss that a bit more, so that these complex problems are broken up or mediated in some sense, and relations are strengthened. And unfortunately, we don't seem to invest enough in innovation platforms. The green economy, the Green Coalition platform might be one such, because these platforms have to create and frame axioms in the way we do research. It needs to create spaces for de-learning of, let's say, the formal agricultural establishment who haven't heard about agroecology. It's not part of their curriculum at all. How do they learn? Can we create opportunities for exposure visits and so on? And how do we design programs so that we plan for transformation in all its dimensions? And I think what we just noticed in the Andhra Pradesh community-based natural farming experiment, and we've been doing a little bit of conversations with some of the natural farming fellows. And that's a very interesting institutional innovation where people from agricultural colleges have been sourced and then asked to go to a particular place after a bit of training in natural farming principles and demonstrate their ability to try and bring about change. And I think when we spoke to some of these very young students who are very knowledgeable, but they do not have this opportunity to actually practice farming. And I think that's the kind of way by which some potential of trying to go to scale. And I think the National Coalition on Natural Farming has much more ideas on this. I'd like to end by remembering a dear friend of many of us who unfortunately passed away a week back. This is the Padma Shri Professor Radha Mohan. Radha Mohan is an interesting example of localization. From remote Odisha, when others were talking about natural farming in other parts of the country, he was an economist by training, but he led environmental movements in Odisha. After retirement, he, of course, is well known for the work that they've done for 90 acres of regeneration through the organization Sambhav, building on permaculture and other kinds of principles and so on. But also equally from people from Odisha, he was a chief information commissioner who nudged the state government to take up the system of rice intensification, who enabled local knowledge to inspire a movement for agroecology. So much so that people in southern Odisha started greeting each other saying Jai Shri. And I think you need some of these intermediaries today to bridge this, this gap between local knowledge and the unfortunately unequal power structures. And we probably require many more such Radha Mohans to bring about this transformation of structures. Thank you.
Thank you so much. There's so much to unpack in what you said, but I think one thing that you said sort of, I think, combines all of it is the institutional innovation that is required. And we do have a lot of questions sort of connected to that. And Merko, when Professor Prasad was talking about de-learning and learning and platforms and programs that are able to sort of build this together or bridge the gaps, I saw that you were nodding your head. So I'm going to connect that with a question that someone has asked, a participant has asked, on how traditional enterprise policies and programs can be transformed to more inclusive, growth-oriented programs and policies. How does all of this come together? So if you could just address this question.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Kanika. I think how this can be transformed, and I think this is what I understand often you from development alternatives, and also when we work with kind of other colleagues which were mentioned, I think which we all have in common. Also when it comes to the Green Economy Coalition that we are also doing with SEED, that we try to run. I mean, currently also we are about to run a kind of what we call kind of practitioner dialogues policy from the SEED side in India. This is about to happen, I think, in the second half of this year, where we try to bring different stakeholders together and prototype new policies. But having said all this, it's very difficult, even by engaging with kind of policymakers, and I'm sure maybe from development alternatives you can share the sentiment, to bring really to bring these different actors together. I mean, it's often really easier said than done, but really having this whole level of I mean, at the very end, it comes always down to the classical thing of trust and relationship building, and that these policymakers are also really listening to these local initiatives. I think we have supported also in the Indian context some exciting enterprises which are there is Last Forest, which is operating in Tamil Nadu. They are also very active with the local government, and they are doing this since 10, 15, 20 years, but it's also very tiresome, right? Building multi-stakeholder partnerships. And we basically have seen that there are some of the enterprises that we are supporting, they have it as part of their DNA, and either either the CEO or somebody in their management team is this people's person and loves to build partnerships. And from our perspective, I mean, when we do in our impact assessment, from our perspective, partnerships are often really the kind of game changer, especially if you want to build it up very inclusive from local, one have it kind of locally embedded, and especially when it comes also to work when it comes to non-timber forestry products, and when you work in this biodiversity context, working with local government, but also when it comes to waste, working with governments, being in a position to form this multi-stakeholder partnerships is critical. But it's also very often, I mean, if I look at the people who are running these enterprises, they're just great in being also able to jump from these different levels, right? They can talk the local language, they can talk the policy language, they can talk the finances language. So it's basically these people who understand, who have this level of empathy, but who are also just working kind of tiresome to make this kind of partnerships happening. So I think I can every day just applaud to them. And I mean, we from the seed side also try to make it happen, but we also clearly see the limits, because there is a limit of this number of people there. But if I would think about this learning initiative that Professor Prasad has mentioned, then we need to basically build a learning initiative of this. I liked really your point of this kind of facilitators of innovation, or this kind of collective, right? These leaders, these facilitators for cross-sectoral partnerships. We need to build this and have more of them. But I know it's easier said than done.
Absolutely, and I think collective wisdom, collective intelligence is the key to unlocking the information gap, or bridge the gap that is there in the system. We have a couple of more interesting questions, which let's talk about market, and couple, you slightly addressed that, and I'd like to get you to answer a question on that. How can local market systems be built such that local food enterprises get an uptick for their produce? If you can address that question, please.
Sure. I think with today's sort of deep penetration of social media and various online platforms into our devices, I think the localized way would be again to have some sort of a local interaction between the producers and through some sort of a technology in between with the direct consumers within that area. So I think with today's most of our phones have a mapping technology, so they know where we are or where the devices are. So if somehow the local producers can tap into this network of local consumers at the same time through the use of technology, I think this is one of the quickest and cheapest ways to do this, which was not possible earlier. I think that's one way. The other way is to also create what I mentioned earlier was about creating micro networks and micro entrepreneurs. So what I'm already hearing, for example, from a lot of farmers here in Maharashtra, they have directly tied up with a few societies or with a few RWAs, and then these producers have a fixed day and time that has been agreed upon between the producer and the consumer society, where they go and they sell whatever they're producing. So some sort of direct linkages with the producer and then the various clusters of people where they live within the cities. And secondly, through the use of technology from especially social media and various apps that are available today to penetrate deeply to your localized consumer base.
Thank you. I think you cannot have a conversation on a topic these days without talking about technology, especially post-pandemic right now. We've also seen some wonderful examples of innovation where entrepreneurs have, in such an ingenious way, looked at market breakthroughs in times of being disconnected. There are apps which have these Indian Hindi labels like Dukaan, and there are several of these things, and somehow you always worry that you always wonder that you've been so worried about digital skills and literacy and all that, but yet somehow the entrepreneurs, the innovators have found a way to be connected. Hence, I think that segues into another question, which I'd like Dr. Khosla and Shambhu to address, is how do we draw these system boundaries when we're talking about analyzing notions of localization, right? Is it I mean, even in any intervention, we do have to have a system boundary that we're talking about. Hence, when you look at consumption, which is outside local region, or if the profits somehow leak out, how would you define that? And I think with technology, it makes it even a little bit more complex. So I'd like to address this to Dr. Khosla and Dr. Prasad, but Mirko and Kapil, if you'd like to jump in on that, please do so.
Well, one of the ways to look at it is sort of ever expanding concentric circles, which allow you to localize in the middle. I mean, that's really the primary purpose of a good local economy, satisfy the local needs, particularly the nutrition and the health of the local people and their children, and their women, and all the people who got left behind. And then certainly there is value in the sense of what several of the speakers said earlier, converting value into prices. So there's no reason why you shouldn't export some things. There's no reason why you shouldn't be making reasonably high returns on certain parts of your produce so that you can invest in other things, in infrastructure, in better educational, institutional frameworks, and so on. So a very important factor in this thing has to be a mix. You've got to get the right mix. The primary priority should be the health and well-being and nourishment of the local population. But that still leaves a fair amount of productive capacity. And therefore, if you do exotics and various kinds of high-value items, nothing wrong with that, provided you do it in the right kind of measure and you're able to sell them through these kinds of technological skills and facilities. Because one of the problems is that you've got to get it from the producer to the consumer, and that's where we have a real problem. The middleman makes a lot of money because he or she is taking the risk and being able to make that connection, bridge that gap. And we need to minimize the cost of that, filling that gap. And hopefully the middle person will make a living too. There's nothing wrong with a middle person making a reasonable living. It's simply that at the moment, they do so in an exploitative kind of way, which usually hurts the poor in the community. But I think Shambhu Prasad probably got much more insight on this than I do, and I would like to give him the floor.
Thanks, Dr. Khosla. Yeah, I think the challenge that we have in terms of the systems is one side is the product side of it, the other is also the knowledge part. And that's where there is a need for people who can bridge these boundaries, because sometimes we've got these silos, especially in agriculture, where an idea that comes from outside the agricultural research establishment is not valued, because the way they look at innovation, all innovation has to happen in agricultural research centers. And anything that comes from outside, local knowledge from civil society, isn't really valued at all. So I think there are certain people who play an important role in trying to bridge this gap. Some of them are also what I would call creative dissenters within the system. And they're not the ones who are going to give narabazi and come out vocally. But I think what we've realized in many cases is the creation of networks actually empowers many of these silent actors to express themselves, because in the hierarchical structures that they are in, often they're not able to express themselves sufficiently. And we need to have many of these knowledge brokers, institutional intermediaries who can try and open up spaces and create this opportunity for interaction. So I think sometimes we are missing those things out. The second point I'd like to make is that while technology has many possibilities today, we are able to reach, any product made here to any other product to the, to a consumer in any part of the country quite well and fast. Logistics has worked very well. Even speed post is actually turning to be much, much more effective than what it was, and the alternate channels. The challenge in some sense is the absence of a local ecosystem. And I think when we talk of make in India or made in India, so I think just adding that bit on making in rural India will transform many ways by which we look at it. I think the challenges in establishing a processing plant in a rural area, the transaction costs involved in it, getting the local actors along, that I think is still a huge challenge today. and we haven't really moved that distance in making it easy for local entrepreneurs in rural areas to reach out to other markets. And that requires a certain amount of investment.
Yeah, so interestingly, we actually have a specific question on that as well, where General President is asking, how are these, someone had mentioned short local supply chains, how are these chains to compete with the already established global chains? I think it would be interesting, Kapil, of course, to get your perspective, but also Mirko, to get a sense of what do you think? Kapil, I think you're on mute.
Can you just repeat the last part? I missed half of your question.
Sure. So the question is that when you're talking about these short local supply chains, how do they compete with the global established chains that exist?
I think, at least in my personal experience, I feel that the local supply chains, they already have an advantage over global supply chains. In various ways. One is, of course, their logistical costs are lesser, their marketing costs are lower, their probably in terms of their warehousing and sort of leasing costs are also lower because they need lesser facilities. They can work out of much more rural areas as compared to global organizations that need much more sort of storage, handling, warehousing areas. Also, it's easier. The locals have a very how should I say, more direct information and knowledge available about the local ecosystem as compared to a global organization. So I think all these advantages are already there. The only disadvantage, I think, is maybe sometimes the initial cloud that's required to get your word out there. So I think the way for smaller organizations is to just start small, not try to even think that these global ones are a huge competitor. You just try to create your own niche, create a small target for yourself, like these guys in Nashik did. They are just targeting one society. They're just working with one society. They bring the produce of their farm and they sell to one society. And that way you can gradually start building up your presence within your local community. And once people know you, I think everybody wants to buy from somebody they know. So I think that's an advantage, an inherent advantage that a local organization has as compared to somebody who's global.
Absolutely. Mirko, Dr. Prasad, would you like to add anything?
Just to supplement what Kapil has said, I think there are major challenges in the business model of an Amazon versus a small enterprise. Amazon can continue to bleed for infinite number of years. So the real challenge, I mean, it's a completely unequal battle in that sense. But what Kapil was alluding to is that very often entrepreneurs can make the mistake of saying, I have this product, I go directly to Amazon and then sell it in this market. But in that kind of a marketplace, your value gets highly diminished. It makes sense only after you built a certain name for yourself, work with local markets and created a local brand. And then Amazon is one of many other vehicles. It might reach you customers, but if you start straight away with Amazon, you're just going to be flooded out and you will lose the battle, because there will always be another person who can get a handloom product much cheaper than you in Amazon, and you would never know whether it's handloom or not. How do you convey your value in this global marketplace if you have not built and established it early?
Absolutely. And I think building value, creating value first, and then getting into out there at a larger scale would definitely be. Kapil, you want to add anything?
Just adding on to a point what Shambhu just mentioned, that I think it comes down to trust. I think the way a local organization can build trust with its audience around, a global cannot, because you can build a relationship. That whole personalization that is sort of lacking in our today's world of e-commerce and everything, that is what a local organization can bring, and that's how you can sort of build the relationship, build the trust over time, and then like Shambhu said, Amazon is just one of many others.
But I think in a life cycle of an enterprise, the challenge is not so much even just the seed capital, but also when you need to grow. And that's when, and like you mentioned, Shambhu, that Amazons of the world can afford to bleed money for years, and finance is also readily available. So Merkur, any thoughts on that aspect of when it comes to growing for these enterprises?
Mm-hmm.
What is possible?
Yeah. So, I mean, maybe three different aspects to it. I think the first aspect is on the journey and the business model. I mean, looking at the enterprises that we have supported, I would say the majority of enterprises definitely first kind of established their, was first trying to capture the local market, because this was easier to kind of figure it out. And then in the next step, moving into kind of global markets. Because when it comes to global regulations, when it comes to export, or even regional markets, I mean, even if I would look at enterprises from Zimbabwe, for them it's easier to export it to South Africa compared to Europe, because if you get it to Europe or to US, obviously standards are a different quality, but also, that's the first aspect. The second aspect is looking at having actually access to both markets from a resilience perspective. And I would like to reference the enterprise that I have mentioned earlier, like Last Forest. They are in the market, I mean, depends a bit, from a for-profit perspective for 10 years, from a non-for-profit perspective for 20 years. And they actually, before COVID, they actually wanted to basically build their fair trade organic market in India, and then they felt during COVID it broke down. And they're about honey, but they also have this this kind of beeswax food wraps, and at the very end they are part of the overall kind of fair trade of the fair trade movement. And then they had large buyers from Europe who actually helped them during COVID, where the local market broke down, to actually basically purchase in bulk like this food wraps, and then this helped them through COVID. And now they actually have decided more towards export market, and to even grow further, more looking at export market, where in the past before COVID they actually were focusing more on the local market. So I think but I think the third argument that I would like to make is, yeah, I mean, it very much we feel this whole idea of market access doesn't matter if it's agriculture, even in a lot of the other businesses, also when it comes to energy. This is one of the kind of biggest challenges that the majority of all the enterprises that we have supported, maybe after access to finance, that all enterprises are struggling with. And I think this is often a bit like under the radar. I mean, this comes to product quality, certification, product development, however you want to call it. But this whole idea of market access, I think, definitely needs to be also much bigger on the radar, and then obviously connected to local value chains or global value chains, depending on which model you are running or which stage of development the enterprise is.
So, thank you. Time for just one last question before we take closing thoughts, which I'm just going to open the floor if anyone wants to address it, is how important are formal connections with local governance systems for local initiatives to be sustainable and resilient over the long term, and also provide a potential for replication?
Yeah, so I might just want to refer to the experiment in Odisha with the Odisha Millet Mission. I think civil society organizations have worked very closely with the state government and have actually broken it down to an engagement with the local organization. So we are at the verge of having a very interesting arrangement where the public distribution system is procuring millets in the local area and also distributing it in the local tribal schools and so on. And I think this possibility is there, but it requires a lot of empowerment of the local institutions, which are otherwise in pretty bad shape. And I think if one thing the pandemic has brought home very closely to us is the importance of local institutions. I mean, the situation would have been miserable if we didn't have these ASHA workers and, you know, many of the panchayat officials working for us. And unfortunately, we are not actually recognizing their contribution. So we really need to invest much more on these local institutions for better delivery of food systems and localization as well. I mean, they really play an important part, but I think the investments in terms of building their capacities, enabling them to experiment, take decisions, all these things are some things that we need to work on.
Thank you. I'd actually like to take this last part of the question and get you to share a little bit or shed light on, as part of your closing thoughts, is how do you replicate these wonderful examples that all of you have been sharing? We could start with any order, but maybe a couple if you'd like to go first.
I think that's a tough one, because sometimes I feel that such ventures are so much, while they seem, there are many out there that have succeeded, there are many more that have not succeeded. So, but I believe that somewhere the answer lies in that whole idea of decentralization, the idea of micro entrepreneurship, the idea of some support, like the what the last question was about, in terms of support from the local authorities or government or other bodies who can support these organizations to get off the ground. Having started and building an organization, I know getting it off the ground is one of the most challenging tasks. Once it's slightly off the ground, with some support from various stakeholders and authorities around, I think it becomes easier for the organization or the entrepreneur to sustain. So I think decentralization, support from the local authorities, and just basically cautiously, maybe creating an ecosystem of people who have gone through this journey, and create somewhat like what an incubatee relationship is, in terms of mentoring people from who have gone through that journey already.
Thank you.
Sorry.
Sorry, Dr. Khosla. I just wanted to mention one small thing before I come to you, that I think Dr. Sahai had mentioned a very important aspect in her video, is that every context is extremely different. And what you're replicating might be more of the technique rather than the recipe. That might be the formula of replication. But Dr. Khosla, please.
Well, it's true. I think the issue is going to have different solutions. My faith in local public institutions isn't perhaps as strong as Shambhu's is, because I've not seen that many totally committed and selfless public servants at the lower levels as I haven't at the top levels. I think there's something about working in a sinecure and a situation in which you can take everything for granted, that drives the motivation for being helpful pretty low. You got to define what it is that they need to be successful. These small enterprises, whether they're in food, whether they're in production, whether they're downstream services, whatever, need access to technology or to the techniques of delivering whatever it is that they want to do. They want access to finance, and they want access to some kind of market, whether it's local or combination of local and outside. And those support systems do not come naturally to government officials. None of those is something they think about in a natural kind of way. Government officials basically look at these things as being top-down, providing, patronizing, providing sort of a giveaway, but not real support, not the kind of support that you need in order to be able to stand on your own feet. I personally have a lot of faith in franchising. I mean, I don't think we've adequately explored. Development Alternatives Group has tried, but I don't think we gave it quite the run for its money that it needed, because it does need a certain amount of level of financial capital and skills to begin with. But certainly, I think the idea of franchising brings like-minded support systems to like-minded supportee systems. The interest of the franchisor in the success of the franchisee is so great that there is a symbiosis there, potential for synergy. And I personally think that a combination of that, together with more supportive local institutions, more supported media and academic support and research support and so on. But basically, the models that seem to work best around the world are where there is a commercial interest in providing those three, particularly those three kinds of supports of technique, technology, and management, then of basically access to finance and access to the ability to manage finance, and also to the access to markets, linking to markets. And frankly, I think personally that cooperatives are the nearest thing we've tried. And the dairy cooperatives have shown it works beautifully. But apart from that, I don't think we've had given it a run for its money. So the cooperative, to me, is a franchising system. I mean, it's basically a not-for-profit. It's a social enterprise in masquerading as well as a franchising system. And I think that's really the future of getting things done. Now, when we talk about franchising, we do not have to have cookie-cutter franchising. It does not have to be like McDonald's, so totally standardized that it doesn't, have room for a certain amount of maneuver in terms of regionalization, of making it appropriate for each circumstance. But I think that can be done if you redesign it, and that's where I would put my money.
Thank you. I just want to also bring one more voice into the room. Ashish Kothari, who's the coordinator of Vikalp Sangam, is reminding us to not replicate or upscale. Every situation is different. Very much resonating with what you said. The need is to outscale, network, create lots of local initiatives and link them up to create scale. Replication, upscaling will kill diversity and local control. I think that seems to be a common thought shared by everyone. But Mirko, your thoughts, or Professor Prasad, either one of you.
I think on this one, I feel strong on this one, because we have three things. We from SEED, we run a global replicator program, and there are kind of three things that we always say. Replication starts with localization, replication starts with adaptation, and replication starts with innovation. So these are the kind of three things. You need to innovate, you need to adapt, you need to localize. That's basically the essential parts of replication. So I think 100% agreed with you. So even when we talk replication, I think also often when others talk replication, they keep this in mind. I think what is great with replication, what we always say, there is, if you take a scale from 0 to 10, you don't start when you replicate at 0, you maybe start somewhere at 2 or 3, right? So you don't need to reinvent the wheel completely, but still you need to still go the way from 3 to 10. And this way from 3 to 10 is the localization, adaptation, and innovation part. And I think this we have seen from innovators around the globe, but I would also strongly encourage replicating, because at least the stuff that people have learned from 0 to 3 is already there, and you don't start from 0. So you can quicker innovate, quicker adapt, and quicker replicate and scale. That's maybe the first one where we also feel strong on replication. The second one is the point on, and now I think I lost my thought, but maybe Professor Prasad wants to go ahead as well.
Yeah, thanks, Marco. I think you brought a interesting dimension to it. Very few investors speak this kind of language, and I wish more of them would. And once that happens, I think the issue of replication is partly solved. I think the bigger challenge is to, change this narrative. I think what Ashish says is, is perfectly right in that sense. We are dealing with a complex system issue. We're not dealing with a simple problem or a complicated problem. And in complex systems, replication is not as easy. You can only replicate processes, but you cannot replicate outcomes, and you cannot have these kinds of unfair expectations on these enterprises. It's important that the enterprise is profitable so that it doesn't need continuous external support. Why should it make supernormal profits? As long as the enterprise is able to profit and maintain relations with customers, that's fine. Others can do something different. There is no need for this to scale or grow the way others are growing. And I think this narratives of growth needs to be questioned. And if you're talking of diverse initiatives, networks play an important role in actually in the process of replication. If Vikalp Sangam is documenting many of these stories and sharing it with others, I think they are actually an important player in replication. So it doesn't have to, you don't need to scale yourself. You can scale the effort or the mission much more than scaling the organization.
Thank you so much. Such interesting thoughts on the topic and specifically on replication and scale. I think a lot of takeaways. Dr. Khosla, could I invite you to just share a vote of thanks and any closing thoughts that you might have?
Well, the idea of a vote of thanks has always worried me because I've never really wanted to vote for anything but good leadership. And if I can say thank you to all the speakers, I really would like to say that this has been an extraordinary trialogue in which we've had very different sets of experiences coming to light here to give us a synthesis, which I think we can take away. Certainly, the work that we do in DA and in our associated companies is going to benefit from this kind of these kinds of insights, and I want to thank you for those. And I hope that this will be the basis of further collaboration with all of you. We would love to work with you all. And I hope that Stella and Kanika will make sure that we're well connected in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Khosla. Fortunately, we are, all of us have always found ways to stay connected and work, but I think more has to be done. What we will also do is just compile a summarization of the conversation that we've had today and share it with everyone. But if any of the participants or the attendees would like to reach out specifically to the panelists and still have any unanswered questions, please feel free to reach out to us and we will certainly connect you to the panelists. This is just also want to mention that this is not the end of the dialogue that we have started. The third event is part of the series is going to be a compilation of interview podcasts with individuals working on localization initiatives across the food system value chain. It will be on 18th June on the Vikalp Sangam YouTube page titled Reclaiming Food Systems Through Sustainable Farming Practices. And the link to the YouTube page is now in the chat box. Thank you. So thank you once again, and let's continue the dialogue and hope to see you all soon. Thank you so much.
Bye.
Thank you all.